marijuana, it becomes legal even for recreational purposes in 2018, which I very much hope it does, and I plan to cast my ballot in favor of the proposal for certain. It helps inform you as to how they're going to act in office. And you can say things, whatever the issues are, whether it has to do with, say, issues of reproductive freedoms for women. In terms of implementation of the law, there's a lot of different ways that you can approach many different issues, depending on whether or not you're pro-choice or you're anti-choice or what have you. But it's the same thing with marijuana, You can say, well, I'm going to implement the law or I'm going to follow the law. But there are a lot of vagaries sometimes, and laws can be interpreted, especially brand new laws that go into effect. There are different ways to analyze that law. So do you want someone who supports legalization and wants to make certain that, marijuana users are not prosecuted unless they're engaged in some other illegal activity like selling to minors or driving under the influence or something? Do you want somebody who essentially believes that marijuana usage should be legal, or do you want somebody, when they're interpreting those laws and when there are times where you don't yet have case law to be very specific about certain different ways in which the law is going to be implemented? Do you want somebody who fundamentally opposed legalization in the first place? And to me, I don't want that. I don't want somebody that I know hates marijuana, can't stomach the thought of even medical marijuana being legal, let alone recreational marijuana. I don't want them in charge of deciding when to prosecute. I just don't. And that's why I'm running.
I heard this today in a courthouse that you've been in many, many times in Wayne County. I'll let the judge remain nameless. And I was joking before how when things like this were said earlier on, I had a difficult time biting my tongue. Like if someone, if a judge alluded to that there was marijuana is a gateway drug, and I couldn't keep quiet. I'd be like, breast milk's a gateway. I couldn't. But anyways, and the other one was always like it's a poorly written law, right? And I heard a judge say that today. That's what happens when the legislature doesn't write a law. And I was like, you know what? If you step back, there's an intention behind this law. It's to minimize arrests of patients or caregivers. The idea that you're going to criminalize from a judicial perspective because this is what Miles is saying too. It's a poorly written law, blah 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 blah. But the result of a poorly written law shouldn't be on the citizens, punishment. It should be on the opposite. And no one took any steps to do that. And that's where I think that that's the key here in this new implementation of a marijuana policy, and why it's so important that people understand what Dana's saying, because it is from this position that the interpretation will be made. If you deem this law poorly written, well, then you can just go to town. You can do whatever you want. No, there's all kinds of carnage. But he does not honestly or intellectually in any way represent the will of the people, because he knows that, one, it is the desire of the state of Michigan to not have these cases federalized. And what's even more, what you were saying, Jane, about his whole concept of marijuana, when you hear him talking about it and the lengths to which he goes to try to justify its evils, that we're waiting on the federal government. Guess what? They're not coming around. Guess what? They have a.
He's running for a state office. Who cares what the federal government has to say?
Yeah. Well, but also, do you use any of those loopholes that exist? Because let's say the law is poorly written. You don't use those loopholes to exploit your ideas that, medical marijuana should not be legal, and then to go after people as a result. I don't believe in that. And I also take issue with, I know that I had seen some sort of reefer madness sort of comparison. I really have a hard time with people talking about overdosing on THC. That bothers me a lot, because we do have some massive problems with overdoses in Michigan, but it involves opioids, it involves alcohol, it could even involve aspirin that is in, your bathroom, cabinet. But I don't like the scare tactics. It bothers me. And, I know so many people that are very dependent upon their prescription for medical marijuana, their medicine. And, it's the stigma that you attach to it, use marijuana and you're going to die. I want to take the stigma away from it, and I want to bring the focus back on the type of drugs that really do cause addiction and really do cause death and really do wreak havoc on our communities. And I'm sorry, I just don't see marijuana as being a product or a plant is really what we should call it, because that's what it is, right? I don't see it fitting into that category, and I'm a little resentful when I see public actors mischaracterize it.
I think most of the time when I've heard you speak about medical marijuana, it is in the context of a story of the opioid crisis, and that's really the way. If you're because with this option of medical marijuana, with the number of people in Michigan that have been diagnosed with chronic pain, which I think is like 27% or something to that effect, Michigan is consuming a lot of So with this other option, it is and he doesn't even recognize that and I think that's the real issue here, that we are living in a crisis of overdoses. Kids are dying in high schools. Every high school is going through this, and it is time to have a different discussion. As you said somewhere, I don't remember, maybe you said, by you interjecting these discussions into the public, it forces the other candidates to talk about it, and we're seeing what they're really made of. And I think it's been refreshing from a political perspective, the untraditional political perspective. I really got to give you a lot of credit, and I know it's not the traditional popular way, and it wouldn't suggest that you'd be that kind of person to do it, but I'm really enjoying watching it, I got to say.
Well, I have to say that I think what separates me from most candidates from this office is that, I spent years prosecuting big cases, really serious cases. But I think the fact that I also practice criminal defense law, and I'm the only person to run for this office, I'm the only person currently running for this office, and the only one, you look back historically at all of the attorneys general that we've had in the state of Michigan, at least going back in my lifetime, we really don't have anybody that's practiced criminal defense law. And, we talk so much about being tough on crime, and I know that my criminal defense record at some point will be used against me, because God forbid we have two sides of the justice system. And we don't live in China. We don't live in North Korea, right? You are entitled to a zealous defense and advocacy on your behalf. But what I have really seen is not just from the prosecution perspective, but I've had real-life clients that have been charged with marijuana offenses. And so when you represent someone, they're not just somebody who's sitting there, in the defendant's chair, and you get to point to them as a prosecutor, as I used to do, and say, the defendant, as though that person didn't even have a name or an identity. I got to know these people personally, and I knew their life stories, and I really began to see how the war on marijuana affected so many good people, and how it wasn't marijuana that was creating havoc in the lives of these people. It was the criminal justice system that was doing it. And I think that's what I bring to this office, is both sides, having seen how marijuana prosecutions affect people and affect communities. But I do want to say this. One of the things that I have found very interesting when I talk about seniors, and it's a story I might have told you, Mike, but it had to do with a number of hospice workers that had enormous concerns about their inability to access medical marijuana, and how they were desperate in some of these counties where they were unable to obtain medical marijuana for their patients. They were desperate for hospice patients to have access to medical marijuana, because the patients vastly preferred that to this gigantic package that the pharmaceutical companies would drop off and dope these people out of their minds, so that essentially they were in a coma for the rest of their lives until they died. And how the patients and the caregivers wanted to see these people be able to say goodbye to their loved ones, or if they had to make arrangements for their personal possessions and their belongings, that they were able to do that. And it was the pharmaceutical companies that seemed to be wanting to fight this the most, because they knew that people would prefer using medical marijuana to just the massive amount of very strong opioids that would just knock people unconscious, and that would be it for them. They could never even really communicate with their families again. And so these hospice workers were very, very upset that they were no longer able to obtain that for their patients. And I mean, isn't that significant? I mean, I think people don't know about that.
Right, they had no choice. I remember you saying you were somewhere where you expected to talk about one of your other platforms, which is the elder abuse to some elderly community. They want to talk about medical marijuana and hospice. I thought that was fascinating, and you're right. And isn't it that they're sidetracked because once they get sent to the hospice, the treatments take them out of position and they can't function. And there's a lot of things that need to be debilitating. Yeah, there's no transition to to the goodbye. They're just in comas and it's over, and it's unpleasant.
Right.
But
it's horrible. It literally, and coming from working with just sick kids that have been in hospice, it gives the families time that they wouldn't have had otherwise, and it's a huge gift for them, and for them to try to take that away, it's heart-wrenching.
That was the thing. Like Lester Grimspoon talked about that a lot. His son died. He's the guy that wrote Marijuana Revisited. His son died of leukemia, and he really appreciated that. Son, after the treatments, they'd be able to go out to dinner and lunch and hang out and just have some. And he reflects on that as how could you not do that? How could you not want to,
it's
in a world of
inhumane.
Civility, not want to allow that as an opportunity? But I know it's still big money. It's a lot. I know there's one of the things that I think is, I know you've been discussing it, is being able to, perform this transition that we hope, where resources are spent less on marijuana and put into what we would call, crimes with victims that don't tie up the labs so much, so they can test the rape kits, and that is always going to be that's because it takes up such a big portion of our court system, such a big portion of the probation departments and the parole departments and the police investigation, the lab. I mean, a lot of people are getting paid from the prosecution of marijuana, and I think that we inevitably that's the hardest battle from that other side. What do you think is the answer, if there is one there?
Well, first of all, there are so many more egregious actors, I guess I would say, that I think are very deserving of prosecution that don't involve anything that is marijuana related. And I look at the things that our AG has chose to focus on, and I look at the things that our AG has chosen to ignore. And I understand your statement about district courts. Firstly, I think we're seeing so much in the way of the opioid epidemic that, we don't have to worry about our district courts, being put out of business anytime soon, do we? I think that there's more than enough business when it comes to that, even though I have strong feelings on, even for people who have opioid addictions, I have strong feelings about treating those people as patients as opposed to treating them as criminals. But I hope that we can move away from a system where people think that the only way they can fund courts is based on their possession of marijuana charges that are coming in. But when you look at the resources that the AG's office has, I think one of the reasons that they've been able to spend so much money and so much in the way of funds in going after, medical marijuana patients and caregivers and dispensaries is because they're not doing anything to, say, prosecute environmental crimes anymore, for instance. And, time was that the office of the AG and Frank Kelly, when he was there, he spent a lot of resources ensuring the safety of the public, that they had clean air and clean water and the preservation of our natural resources. And, we don't do that anymore in this state, right? That's not what the AG's office is utilized for. And, in fact, I see so many instances where the AG is working hand in hand with, corporations in terms of allowing them to have permits, for instance, that increase the amount of toxins that they're able to levy into the air, to the ground, into the water, and instead of prosecuting those cases. So, that being the case, maybe we take the resources and we refocus it on actually protecting our communities. And protecting our communities are going after bad corporate actors that are poisoning our communities, or bad corporate actors that are scamming people.